Imagine standing in the middle of a vast, frozen forest. It's so quiet that the only thing you can hear is the sound of your own blood pumping in your ears. The temperature is dropped to 40 degrees below zero. If you breathe out too hard, the moisture in your breath turns into ice crystals instantly. You are part of a massive, powerful army. You have tanks, you have planes, and you have thousands of men around you. But you feel completely alone. You are terrified because you know that somewhere out there, hidden in the white blur of the snow, is a ghost. You can't see him, you can't hear him, and you certainly can't find him. But he has seen you, and in a few seconds, for one of your friends, the world is going to go black. This isn't a ghost story, though. This is the real-life account of a 5-foot-tall farmer who decided to protect his home. This is the story of the man they called the White Death. To understand how this story even happens, we have to look at the world back in November of 1939. At that time, the Soviet Union was a massive giant. Joseph Stalin looked at the map and decided he wanted a piece of Finland. He wanted to push the border back to protect the city of Leningrad. He thought it would be an easy win. He actually believed his army would march into Finland and the people would welcome them with open arms. He was so sure of himself that he didn't even prepare his soldiers for a real winter war. They were sent into the Finnish wilderness wearing dark green and brown uniforms. Against the bright, blinding white snow of Finland, they looked like targets on a shooting range. Now, let's look at the other side of the border. There was a man named Simo Häyhä. If you met him on the street, you probably wouldn't even notice him. He was a small, quiet man, standing just over 5 feet tall. He lived in a tiny village called Rautjärvi, right near the Russian border. Simo wasn't a professional soldier. He wasn't a special forces operator or a trained assassin. He was a farmer. He spent his days working the land, chopping wood, and doing chores. But in his free time, he loved to hunt. He had been roaming the Finnish forest since he was a little boy. He knew how to track a rabbit through thick brush, how to tell which way the wind was blowing by the feel on his skin, and most importantly, how to stay perfectly still. When the call came for him to defend his country, Simo didn't go out and buy a fancy new weapon. He reached for his trusty hunting rifle. It was a Finnish version of the Mosin Nagant, a heavy, old-fashioned bolt-action gun. And here is where the legend of the White Death, Simo Häyhä, world's deadliest sniper, really starts to get interesting. Most snipers in the world use a telescope or a scope on top of their rifle. It helps them see targets from very far away. But Simo refused to use one. He used the iron sights, the little metal notches on the barrel of the gun. People asked him why, and his reasons were incredibly smart. First, he knew that glass reflects light. If the sun hit a sniper's scope just right, it would create a tiny flash of light. To a trained eye, that flash is like a giant sign saying, "I am right here, come shoot me." Second, a scope sits on top of the rifle, which means the shooter has to lift his head up a few inches to look through it. Simo knew that in the world of snipers, the man who keeps his head the lowest lives the longest. By using the iron sights, he could keep his face pressed deep into the snow, making him almost impossible to see. When Simo went out to the front lines, he didn't just walk into the woods and start shooting. He was like an artist preparing a canvas. He would wake up long before the sun, while the world was still pitch black. He would pack a little bit of dry bread, some sugar for energy, and plenty of ammunition. Then he would crawl out into no man's land, the dangerous area between the two armies. He would find a spot that gave him a good view of a road or a clearing where the Soviet soldiers were likely to pass. But he didn't just sit behind a bush. He built what he called a nest. He would pack the snow down with his hands until it was hard as a rock. He did this so that when he fired his rifle, the blast of air from the barrel wouldn't blow the loose snow around.
If the snow moved, the enemy would see the puff of white and know exactly where he was hiding. He would even pour water on the snow in front of his rifle so it would freeze into a sheet of solid ice. This way, the muzzle blast wouldn't move a single snowflake. The most human and yet most intense part of his routine was what he did with his mouth. Think about how cold it is, 40 below zero. When you breathe, your breath turns into a white cloud of steam. In a silent, frozen forest, that little puff of steam is like a signal fire. So Simo would keep a mouthful of snow at all times. He kept the snow in his mouth so that his breath would stay cold and wouldn't create any vapor. He would lie there buried in the snow for 10, 12, sometimes 15 hours a day, perfectly still, with a mouth full of ice. That is the kind of discipline that made him the farmer who terrified the Soviet army. In the beginning, the Soviets didn't know what they were dealing with. They just knew they were losing soldiers. A group of men would be walking down a road, and suddenly the man in the front would drop. No sound, no warning. The soldiers would scramble for cover, looking into the trees, but they would see nothing. They would fire their machine guns wildly into the forest, hoping to hit something, but Simo would just lie there, motionless, letting the bullets fly overhead. He was patient. He would wait for the panic to die down, and then he would take another shot. Simo was a master of psychology. He didn't just shoot anyone. He waited for the officers. He knew that the Soviet army was very rigid. The soldiers didn't know what to do without orders. If he took out the man in charge, the rest of the unit would fall apart. They would become disorganized, scared, and even easier to pick off. Soon, word began to spread through the Soviet ranks. They started talking about a ghost in the woods. They called him Belaya Smert, which literally translates to the White Death. It wasn't just a nickname, it was a shadow that followed them everywhere. The Soviet commanders were furious. They were being humiliated by a small country they thought they could crush in a week. They decided that this one sniper had to be stopped at all costs. They started by sending their own elite snipers to hunt him down. These were men who had been trained in the best schools in Moscow. They had the best gear and the best scopes. They went into the woods with one mission: find Simo and kill him. But they made a fatal mistake. They didn't understand the land like Simo did. They would climb up into the branches of pine trees, thinking it gave them a better vantage point. Simo would see them instantly. He used to laugh about it later in life, saying that a man in a tree is just a target with nowhere to run. He would wait for them to adjust their scope, catch the glint of the sun on their lens, and that was the end of it. One by one, the experts sent to kill him never returned. When snipers didn't work, the Soviets turned to artillery. They would identify a general area where they thought the White Death was hiding, and they would rain down hundreds of high-explosive shells. They turned beautiful, ancient forests into craters and splintered wood. It was scorched earth. But Simo was a ghost. He would hear the shells coming. He would crawl into a deep snowbank or slip behind a massive boulder, and he would wait. He was like the winter itself. You can't kill the cold, and you couldn't kill Simo. Once the shelling stopped and the Soviet patrols walked in to check the damage, they would find Simo right where he always was.
The sheer numbers associated with Simo are hard to wrap your head around. In just about 100 days of active combat, he had over 500 confirmed kills. If you do the math, that is an average of 5 kills every single day for over 3 months. Some days he would get 20 or more. And remember, he was doing this with a basic hunting rifle, no scope, in the most miserable weather conditions on the planet. He wasn't doing it for glory. He wasn't doing it because he liked it. He was doing it because he was a farmer protecting his farm. There's a very deep human side to this that we often forget when we talk about war heroes. Simo was a very humble man. He didn't see himself as a legend. Later in his life, when journalists would ask him if he felt bad about all the people he had killed, he would give a very honest, simple answer. He said that he was just doing what he was told to do as well as he could. To him, the Soviet soldiers weren't just enemies, they were people who had come into his home uninvited. He felt that if he didn't stop them, they would hurt his family and take his land. It was a very basic human instinct. But every story like this has a moment where luck runs out. For Simo, that day was March 6, 1940. He was out in the woods as usual, but the Soviets were getting desperate. They were flooding the forest with thousands of men, hoping to just stumble upon him. During a chaotic firefight, a Soviet soldier finally spotted a tiny movement in the snow. He fired a shot, but it wasn't a regular bullet. It was an explosive round. The bullet hit Simo right in the jaw. It was a horrific injury. The impact shattered his bone and tore away almost the entire left side of his face. His fellow Finnish soldiers found him and dragged him back through the snow. They later said that when they looked at him, they thought half of his head was gone. They rushed him to a field hospital, but the doctors didn't have much hope. He had lost so much blood, and his face was completely destroyed. He fell into a deep coma, and the word went out that the White Death had finally fallen. But then something miraculous happened. Simo Häyhä was just too stubborn to die. For days he lay in that hospital bed, hovering between life and death. And then, on March 13th, he finally opened his eyes. And here is the most incredible coincidence in the history of warfare. March 13th was the exact day that the peace treaty was signed between Finland and the Soviet Union. The war ended on the very day that its greatest protector woke up. It was as if his spirit had stayed in the fight just long enough to ensure his country was safe, and only then did he allow himself to return to the living. The road to recovery was long and painful. Simo had to undergo 26 different surgeries to fix his face. They had to take bone from his hip to rebuild his jaw. He lived the rest of his life with a very deep scar and a face that looked different, but he never complained. He didn't want a pension from the government, and he didn't want to be a politician. As soon as he was healthy enough, he went right back to his village. He went back to farming, back to raising dogs, and back to hunting in the same woods where he had once been a ghost. For the next 60 years, Simo lived a quiet life. He became a world-class moose hunter and a breeder of hunting dogs. People would travel from all over the world to meet him, but he was always very modest. He didn't brag about his 500 kills. He didn't talk about being the deadliest man in history. When someone once asked him how he got so good at shooting, he gave a one-word answer that we should all remember: practice. He didn't think he was special. He just thought he had worked harder than everyone else. Simo Häyhä passed away in a veterans' home in 2002 at the age of 96. He lived to see the Soviet Union fall, and he lived to see his beloved Finland grow into a peaceful, prosperous nation. He died as a quiet farmer, the same way he had started. He is a reminder that you don't need a massive army or the most expensive technology to make a difference. Sometimes all you need is a man who knows his land, a steady hand, and the heart to defend his home. I hope you found Simo's story as fascinating as I did. There is something truly special about the little guy standing up to a giant and winning. It's a story about human endurance, about the power of focus, and about what it really means to be a hero. If you enjoyed this deep dive into history, please make sure to hit that like button. It really helps the channel get these stories out to more people. And if you want to hear more about the legends and the strange but true stories of our past, please subscribe to the channel. It honestly means a lot to have you here in our community. This has been a journey through time and the frozen woods of Finland with me, here at Ethereal Bygoner. Thank you so much for watching. Stay safe, and I will see you in the next story.